Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, it's quite difficult having to deal with two attacks on workers' rights in one day. Quite difficult, may I say. And may I put on the record, Mr Speaker, an invitation to Kate Wilkinson to turn up to the CTU rallies on Saturday in Auckland, Wellington, Dunedin, and Christchurch, and Dunedin's on Sunday. Okay, turn up and justify these changes to New Zealand workers, because she will find it very difficult. And one of the things that makes me very angry in this House is when members like the former Speaker and others talk about what's good for New Zealand wage and salary earners, when clearly they don't talk to them. They only talk to their friends in business. They only go along, the announcements at the National Party conference were all about their big business backers. And making sure that they continue to fund the National Party into the next election. And so I thought I'd start my contribution today, Mr Speaker, but just reflecting on where we're at, actually, what we're looking to change, what the current legislation says and where that came from. Currently, workers in New Zealand are entitled to 4 weeks of annual holidays for rest and recreation. Now, who brought that in? It was the Labour Party that brought them in. It took 30 years for workers to go from, New Zealand wage and salary earners, to go from having 3 weeks holiday to 4 weeks holiday. It was the Labour government that did that. Paid public holidays, time and a half on a public holiday. And I'm really, really pleased, that we're not now looking at a pushback on paying time and a half on public holidays and a day in lieu, even though there are some things I'll talk about that. But Labour brought that in. Prior to a Labour government, workers who had to work on a statutory holiday, a public holiday, got a day in lieu, but they got no extra money for it unless it was in their agreement, and that was really, really hard. The 5 days of sick leave, even that's under attack as well, of course, but that came in under a Labour government. It came in under a Labour government and added bereavement leave to that. So, these are the things that Labour brought in. This government, it's quite, in some ways reassuring, Mr Speaker, that they haven't really been able to go out on an all-out attack on the things that Labour has entrenched in the minds of New Zealand workers, New Zealand wage and salary earners, about being their entitlements. So they're coming at it another way. I thought it was interesting in the Minister's speech when she talked about cashing up annual leave. As I said, it took us 30 years to get to 4 weeks leave. In the previous debate about the Employment Relations Amendment Act, the changes, she couldn't wait, and all her colleagues, to talk about what happens in Australia with trial periods. Interesting, in Australia, they've had 4 weeks annual leave for a long time. They can't cash that up. They can go beyond that and cash it up if that's part of their agreement. But they have had 4 weeks annual leave for years and years, just as they've had many, many other things. More going to Australia. And I can understand, and I think we on this side of the House can understand, any worker that looks at the fact that they've had no pay increase under this government in the last 2 years, unless they're on minimum wage. Then it was a measly 25 cents or 25 cents an hour. I can understand when they look at their household bills and they think about how they're going to feed their children, they might think, well, cashing up the 4 weeks leave is quite a good idea. I can understand that. And so our leader, Phil Goff, was trying to explain that when that's what he was saying about our position on the 4 weeks leave. But underpinning the 4 weeks leave, from our position, is it's about rest and recreation. New Zealand workers, New Zealand employees work some of the longest hours in the OECD and have some of the fewest holidays in the OECD. And the interesting thing about that, I read an article the other day about Japan. The only other country that works longer hours than New Zealand is Japan. And they've got this thing happening called karoshi, Mr Speaker, where people are working such long hours, they're actually dying from overwork. We have so few regulations around rest and recreation and breaks and holidays. We have almost no working hours regulation in this country. It's so deregulated, it's not funny. The only other thing we have is meals and rest breaks, and hey, guess what's happening to them? They're in the select committee right at the moment trying to take them away. Labor's doing its best to try and make sure that there's protections for people. But actually what's happening with that, Jackie Blue, is the situation where workers can be required to work during an unpaid meal break. I remember, I think that used to be called slavery, didn't it, where you worked for nothing? That's what I think that's called. There's other things in this bill, but before I move on from annual leave, I do remember National did vote against the 4th week's annual leave, and John Key called it a bribe. That's what he called it. That's what he called it. Now, they can try and write in all the protections they like, but the fact is many, many workers are going to come under pressure to cash up that 4th week's leave. We should be encouraging people to take leave and time off with their families, their 4 weeks with their families. That's why we've got the social problems that we have see around the country. That's why families are under pressure. And then we move on to the public holidays and the proposals in the bill to transfer the public holidays. Now, I don't know where this came from, Mr Speaker. It certainly wasn't a National Party policy, it wasn't a National Party election promise. It wasn't in your manifesto. It wasn't, Minister. It was not in your manifesto. The whole thing about relevant daily pay. But transferring public holidays was not in your manifesto. So I can kind of accept the thing about the 4th week's leave, even though I don't agree with it, because you did go out to the voting public and say, this is what we're going to do. So they had a chance to understand that. But this transferring of public holidays seems to have risen in the last couple of years, and I'm on the Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee, and I remember some employers coming along and proposing that it would be a good idea to be able to transfer public holidays, the 11 public holidays that we recognise in New Zealand, the festivals, to some other day, which could be another cultural festival or whatever. Well, OK, that all sounds very, very good, and I see the Minister's tried to write in protections to make sure that the transfer of the public holiday is not to avoid paying the time and a half on the day. But, you know, in reality what will happen is because at the end of the day, if the employer and employee can't reach agreement on a transfer, the employer gets to decide. So we could have workers working on Christmas Day, away from their families, having to work on Christmas Day, not being paid time and a half, and at some other time during the year the employer will decide that that's Christmas Day. So it could be, in April, it could be the 1st of April. What a joke. What an absolute joke that is. So, there's some very, very real concerns around the public holidays transfer. No one asked for it that I understand, except Business New Zealand and the employers and manufacturers who came up with a bright idea, and the way I saw that at the time was a way of trying to get out of paying 11 public holidays, when in actual fact we've got a problem next year. We should be paying an extra holiday because we've got Easter. That's right, that's what my colleague Grant, we've got Easter and Anzac on the same day, so we need to be looking at that. You'd rather have 4 weeks holiday? Well, that's true, yes. Well, I'm sure many, many workers would. And then, of course, we get on to the whole thing around sickies, and the whole the tone of this is that workers cannot be trusted. They can't be trusted. They're so untrustworthy that their employer can require them to go to the doctor and provide a medical certificate on their first day of illness. Now, that is so unfair. If you have a sick child, is the worker really expected to drag that child out of bed, go off to the doctor and get a medical certificate? In actual fact, we've heard it from the doctors. They won't appreciate it. I go to my doctor sometimes. There's such a big queue, particularly in the winter, when there's so many cases of flu. You won't get in to see your doctor. What happens then? Well, you infect other people, that's right. So then you drag yourself off to work, It's just ridiculous. And the whole argument around the employers, the minister's removal of the word reasonable is an interesting one too, because that flows over into the Employment Relations Act, and we had a discussion on that earlier. So, in closing, Mr Speaker, I just want to say this is helping us drift further away from Australia. We're going to see more people getting on the planes, going off to Australia, because they don't have to argue about their holidays in Australia. They don't have to argue. 40 families from Whangarei went off to Australia last week. Who can blame them? In Australia, they get treated properly, they get time off with their families, and they don't have to put up with this nonsense.
Very good. A point of order, Keith Locke.
I seek
leave for the House to rise at this point? I think people are sort of dashing
Leave is
off
sought
with it.
for the House to now rise. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? Yes, there is. A point of order. Trevor Mallett.
Mr. Speaker, sorry, I'll just get McGee out and see if I can get the appropriate point. I think we are getting to the